Hi, this is Bill, and this is Propaganda. In September of 1974, Robert Fripp put an end to the career arc of the original King Crimson. He did this some 3 weeks after Fripp, John Wetton, and Bill Bruford created that band's last classic album, Red, in the summer of 1974. At the time, Fripp proclaimed that the band had ceased to exist and that they would be gone forever and ever. That, of course, was not the case. In 1981, a new version of King Crimson, featuring Fripp, Bill Bruford, and newcomers Adrian Belew and Tony Levin, emerged and made an everlasting imprint on progressive rock history in their own right. A lot happened in Robert Fripp's career and in his personal life over the course of the 6 years and change between the declaration that the original King Crimson was over versus the formation of the new band. In this episode, I'm going to provide a synopsis of the various events that happened over the course of that time frame. I'm not going to discuss them in very deep detail because there are some terrific books on the market that I'll provide a list of at the end of the episode, where you can find a lot of the details. What I will attempt to do, though, is to provide a bird's eye view of some of what I personally observed in Fripp's career over this time. I got to see Fripp at 3 different performances during the 6.5 years that King Crimson wasn't in operation, and also saw him in videos and heard him on bootleg tapes that were produced over that time. So what I'm going to attempt to do is provide my recollections and opinions of those as a point of reference in order to give a sense of the things that were happening in Fripp's career in the late 1970s and how all of that came to influence what ultimately became the 1980s version of King Crimson. King Crimson broke up for a number of reasons. Robert Fripp, in his own words, has referred to some of the issues that he had playing with John Wetton and Bill Bruford on stage in this time frame, where his guitar was competing with what Fripp referred to as the flying brick wall of bass and drums. There were other issues at hand, though, too. John Wetton was becoming a bit of a mismatch for Fripp, both in terms of his behavior on tour. Wetton, always a heavy drinker, had also by the 1974 tour of Crimson begun using cocaine. Wetton also had ideas about moving King Crimson into a more commercial direction. He referred to, at the time of the recording of Red, wanting to push King Crimson more into Pink Floyd territory, which I suspect was not a fit to what Fripp wanted at all. Perhaps even most importantly, though, was that Fripp had not seen a vacation since he had become a professional musician in the middle 60s. Specifically during the time going back to the band that was the precursor to King Crimson, Giles and Fripp, up to the then present day in the summer of 1974, Fripp had effectively taken no time off whatsoever. He went from one version of Crimson to the next out of commercial necessity in order to get those new versions of the band with new musicians established. And as a result, took very, very little time off. Fripp was also beginning to wonder whether it was all worth it, whether his success as a musician was really the most important thing in life to him. Around this same time, Fripp first discovered the writings of the spiritualist John G. Bennett. Bennett, in turn, had significant influence in his philosophy from the Greek philosopher George Gurdjieff, where Gurdjieff and Bennett both believed that human beings were placed on Earth to be able to achieve a higher plane of existence beyond the everyday. Fripp bought into this philosophy in a very big way. He would later say that reading Bennett's work for the first time made the top of his head blow open. And he resolved that he would follow the path of Bennett's teachings in some detail once he took a sabbatical from King Crimson, which is effectively what the ending of Crimson's career arc in September of '74 became. Which is not to say that Fripp completely took time off. He was too much of a workaholic for that, and also had other projects that needed attention. At the time that King Crimson broke up, Fripp had been working with Brian Eno on a project that would eventually become their album Evening Star. And then subsequent to that, Fripp worked on a couple of additional King Crimson projects. In the spring of 1975, Fripp re-entered the recording studio briefly with John Wetton and with Eddie Jobson as a session player to complete overdubs on the album that would be released in the spring of 1975 as King Crimson USA, the live album that was effectively the band's swan song. Finally, in late 1975, Fripp curated the release of a King Crimson Greatest Hits compilation, The Young Person's Guide to King Crimson, which became an essential purchase for its inclusion of several tracks that were not available elsewhere, as well as a very detailed booklet on the band's history from the days of Giles and Fripp until its breakup. Interestingly, The Young Person's Guide was not released in the United States by King Crimson's distributor, Atlantic Records. Atlantic did release it in Canada, but not in the US. As I mentioned, just by virtue of the non-released tracks and the booklet, King Crimson fans had more than enough reason to buy this album in the United States, and many of them did buy it as an import. Fripp spent a fair amount of late 1975 and early 1976 at the school that John G. Bennett founded in England prior to his death in 1971, the International Academy for Continuous Education. By late 1976, Fripp was ready to get back to work. He signed on as a session musician in support of Peter Gabriel's first solo album, which was released in the spring of 1977. This album was notable not only because it was the first of several collaborations between Fripp and Gabriel, but it also included the work of the bassist Tony Levin, who Fripp would meet for the first time. Levin, by 1976, was already a very well-established session musician, having worked with several American artists, including Paul Simon. Obviously, Tony Levin returns to this story a little bit later. Fripp would go on tour with Gabriel to support the first album as well. More often than not, when performing live with Gabriel's band on the 1977 tour, Fripp would perform from behind the stage curtains. He would not be visible to the audience. On other occasions, he would be visible, and on still others, he would use a pseudonym, Dusty Rhodes, rather than his own name. Very rarely was he announced by Peter Gabriel as a member of the stage band. I was fortunate enough, fairly early on in Peter Gabriel's 1977 tour, to obtain a bootleg tape from the very first show that Gabriel performed with this band in March of 1977 at the Capitol Theater in Passaic, New Jersey. It was very interesting when Gabriel got to the section of the show where he did band introductions. He opened this by saying, "I'd like to introduce the Visible Band." And I could actually hear my friend, Jeff, who made the tape, saying in the background, "The visible band! Fripp is not visible!" Because it was well known to the fans in attendance who had been hanging out by the stage door prior to the show that Robert Fripp was indeed in attendance and playing with the band. Around the same time, Robert Fripp had made the decision to change his surroundings. He was of the opinion that he had stayed for far too long in the same musician circles in London and in Dorset in the UK, and felt that the change of scenery would broaden his perspective and help him to determine what his next moves might be. Fripp chose to move to New York City, to the Hell's Kitchen district in Manhattan. And through his record company contacts and his contacts in England, very quickly became established in the burgeoning new wave and punk rock scene in New York, doing sessions for many artists, including Blondie and Talking Heads, among others. He also, during this time, began work as a record producer. Fripp had produced a couple of projects during his days with King Crimson, but they were relatively small projects that didn't seek nor obtain a large audience. And this time around, he was working with more lofty aspirations in mind. The first production assignment Fripp went after was one with Daryl Hall. By 1977, Daryl Hall and his partner John Oates were just getting traction as far as their professional success was concerned. They had recently reestablished themselves with RCA Records and had two major hits with RCA, Sarah Smile and Rich Girl. Hall was wanting to, in making a solo album, establish himself as more as just a pop and R&B singer, and was very keen to make a recording with Robert Fripp to get into other areas of the musical spectrum. RCA Records was not particularly pleased by this. They knew Robert Fripp's reputation from King Crimson all too well and were worried that Fripp's experimental tendencies might hurt the commercial viability of Hall & Oates. When the album Fripp and Hall made together, Sacred Songs, was finished, RCA reviewed it and at least initially viewed it as being commercially unviable and put it on the shelf, much to Fripp's and to Hall's chagrin. Over the course of these sessions, Fripp recorded several songs with Hall that had a different destination intended, namely a first solo album by Fripp. We'll get back to that in a moment. Following the making of Sacred Songs, Fripp next worked on a production assignment with Peter Gabriel. This resulted in Peter Gabriel's second album, which included several songs where Fripp had a huge influence in terms of the final product, including Exposure and White Shadow. The second album from Gabriel was not as successful as his first, but was very well reviewed. And the two would work together again about a year or so later on Gabriel's third album. Fripp and Gabriel also, as Fripp did with Hall, recorded various tunes that were intended for Fripp's first solo album project. Fripp's first solo album, Exposure, ultimately appeared in April of 1979. In the liner notes to the Exposure album, Fripp provided a summary of his intentions in pursuing his projects with Daryl Hall, Peter Gabriel, and the Exposure album itself. Fripp explained that what he was wanting to do was to complete a middle-of-the-road album trilogy of the three albums in order to explore the possibilities of the pop song as both a commercial and as an artistic vehicle. RCA Records not releasing Daryl Hall's Sacred Songs album, in some regards, threw a fly into that ointment. Fripp explained in the liner notes that what he was now looking to do was to leverage Exposure as the first of three projects that he would pursue as part of his professional scope. he referred to this overall project as the Drive to 1981. Fripp defined that there would be 3 parts to the Drive to 1981. Exposure, again, was the first. The second would be based on his Frippertronics tape looping and overdubbing technique. And the third would be called Discotronics, exploring music for dance as a way to communicate with an audience. With the Exposure album now complete, and given that that album had been cobbled together by various groups of musicians performing on other projects, there really was not an effective way to support that album with a tour. Fripp did the next best thing. He pursued the second piece of the Drive to 1981 through a Frippertronics tour. What Fripp did was to take his small independent working unit, as he sometimes called it, to small non-conventional venues like bars, restaurants, and other facilities that wouldn't ordinarily sponsor musical concerts. Over the course of 1979, Fripp made numerous appearances in Manhattan and in Los Angeles, presenting Frippertronics shows. One of the more famous of those was done in Los Angeles and filmed for the late-night television program in the United States, The Midnight Special. That is a performance that you can see on YouTube, and which is a very entertaining one, as well as interesting to see how Fripp addresses his audience before he begins playing. Fripp's concerts during this period were very interesting to watch, in that the music was basically constructed in real time. Fripp's approach was often to record a background of overdubs using the Frippertronics technique on his reel-to-reel decks, and then go back and rewind that to the beginning and play that music as a backdrop that he could then play an electric guitar lead solo over for a finished product. It was something that was very interesting to behold, to be sure. And it was something that his audience members recognized would have a market. There were notable instances both in L.A. at Madame Wang's Chinese restaurant, a punk rock venue, as well as in New York, where Fripp often performed at a venue called The Kitchen, where people attempted to bootleg Fripp's shows. In the case of one such incident at The Kitchen, the bootlegger advertised in the Village Voice newspaper that he had recorded the show and was willing to sell copies. The bootlegger would be very surprised in one instance of negotiating a sale of his tape over the phone to find out that the potential buyer was Robert Fripp himself, who wanted not a copy, but the master copy so that no more bootlegging of his performance could be done. He went one step farther at a concert at Madame Wang's in Los Angeles, where he saw the bootlegger actually recording the show as he was playing it, stopped the show, and confiscated the tape. Mr. Fripp was not messing around as far as protecting his intellectual property was concerned. Fripp's Frippertronics shows ultimately resulted in an album released in early 1980 called God Save the Queen, Under Heavy Manners. This was an album that was separated into 2 parts, with one side, God Save the Queen, covering his Frippertronics work, and the other side, Under Heavy Manners, going one step further, taking Frippertronics tape loops and redubbing them with a rhythm section so as to make the music danceable. On the Under Heavy Manners side of the album, one of the songs, in fact, contains vocals, provided by Talking Heads' David Byrne, under a pseudonym. One of the things that's interesting about this album, and I happen to own a test pressing copy of the album, I've had it in my collection now for many years. One of the things that is of particular note about this album is that it doesn't have a side 1 and side 2 or A or B distinction of it. One side of the album is called Side 1, and the other is called Side A, again underscoring that it's one album containing pieces of two different projects. Upon Fripp's completing God Save the Queen under Heavy Manners, EG Records began approaching with Fripp discussions around what his next project might be, and began dropping some serious hints about Fripp putting together a band for purposes of making more commercial impact than he was with these smaller projects. And in early 1980, Fripp did indeed put together a band, but it was not exactly what EG Records anticipated. Fripp decided to go one step farther with his Discotronics experiment and formed a Discotronics touring band called the League of Gentlemen. This was actually a relatively formidable group of musicians in retrospect, including Barry Andrews, the ex-keyboards player from the band XTC, Sarah Lee, who at the time was something of a novice bass player but stayed in the business for a while working with bands as notable as Gang of Four and the Indigo Girls, and the drummer Johnny Ilikoff, credited on stage and on record as Johnny Too Bad. This band worked for 3 periods during 1980. The first and longest period was from the spring of 1980 into late July. I happened to see the League of Gentlemen play live on July 20th, 1980 in New York at the Irving Plaza Club. Irving Plaza was a small general admission venue that at the time did not have seating. It was intended to basically be an open dance floor. And part of Fripp's intention in backing that particular venue, I suspect, was to present his music as dance music and to encourage the audience to dance. There were at least 2 instances during the band's performance when, without warning, the house lights went down completely. They weren't faded down, they just went out. And the audience began booing loudly. They wanted to see the musicians play. The house lights then went back up with Fripp shaking his head and laughing to himself. Clearly, he had told the technicians to turn the house lights down. He wanted them down to see how the audience would react. The reaction he got maybe wasn't the one he expected, but in any event, he conducted his experiment and I guess was happy with it. I enjoyed the League of Gentlemen's concert very much from the standpoint of what I later learned Fripp was looking to accomplish, that is, to gauge and build audience camaraderie through the vibe of the music more so than through, technical excellence of the players. I think he accomplished that brilliantly. But what I've always remembered in more vivid detail about the show, in retrospect, was Fripp's opening act. A band called Gaga opened for Fripp and the League of Gentlemen that night. Gaga was a project being run by the guitarist Adrian Belew. Adrian Belew, in 1980, had established himself reasonably well on the rock and roll scene. He had worked on a lengthy tour with Frank Zappa, and near the end of that tour was effectively poached from Zappa's band by David Bowie, who took Belew out on the road to work with him on his tour supporting his album Heroes, a gig that Robert Fripp had in fact been offered since Fripp had played on the Heroes album sessions with David Bowie. Sometime beforehand, Belew had met Fripp at a social function, and the two stayed in contact, with Fripp and his organization ultimately contacting Belew about opening for the League of Gentlemen at these shows in New York, and Fripp and Belew would continue to stay in touch. As I mentioned earlier, the League of Gentlemen scheduled 3 different periods of touring during 1980. The first, as I mentioned, was the American tour that ended in July. They also had a brief tour in the summer months of 1980 and a final tour during November. During the November tour, Johnny Ilikoff was replaced as the band's drummer by Kevin Wilkinson. Johnny Ilikoff, it turned out, had a heroin habit and was becoming quite unreliable in performance. And so Kevin Wilkinson, his replacement, finished out the tour and then subsequently would appear on most of the songs that were included on the one and only League of Gentlemen album that was released by Fripp in February of 1981. The League of Gentlemen album pointed a sign towards the future, although it wasn't clear necessarily at the time. On the run-out groove of the album on side 2, inscribed on the groove is a message. The next step is discipline. We were soon to find out what that meant. By the end of the League of Gentlemen tour, Fripp had begun seriously thinking about EG Records' request to form a proper, commercially minded band. In subsequent statements to the press, Fripp would explain his motivation here, saying that from the standpoint of how the music business now worked, a band could be in one of 3 different categories, or divisions as he called them. Division 3, effectively, was what he was doing with Frippertronics. It was interesting, and you'd build a reputation from it, but you probably couldn't support yourself. Division 2 was the level at which the League of Gentlemen were working. You might be able to support yourselves, but you probably wouldn't be able to make a significant amount of money. You'd be having to scuffle a good portion of the time. Division 1, of course, was where a commercially successful band would be, but it required hard work to get records out there and to support them with major tours. EG Records obviously wanted to leverage Fripp's name recognition in a first division band, and by late 1980 had a plan in mind that ultimately would be embraced by Fripp and by his previous bandmate from King Crimson, Bill Bruford. EG Records in late 1980 had an American distribution contract with Polydor Records. Polydor was a label that was struggling to stay afloat. Their fortunes would change starting in 1981 after their merger with Phonogram, who marketed Mercury Records. And the 2 companies together would form the basis, along with the MCA Corporation, of the current Universal Music Group. But in 1980, Polydor was struggling, so much so that they were wanting to get everything they could out of their better-known artists. Polydor was having a problem in particular with the artists Robert Fripp and Bill Bruford that they had signed through EG Records. We've already gone over Fripp's more experimental works here in this episode. Bill Bruford, in the same time frame, was fronting his jazz fusion band, Bruford, which were critically acclaimed, but did not sell very many records. Upon doing an audit of the band on the road during their tour during the summer of 1980 for the band's 3rd album, EG discovered, as they went and followed the band from Philadelphia to New York to Boston, that many of the same fans were in attendance at all 3 shows. EG was recognizing that there really wasn't that much of a market for what Bruford was doing. As Bruford was on the road finishing his tour, he heard from EG and said, "Your band is over, we're terminating your contract." And they, at that time, suggested to Bruford that maybe he should contact Robert Fripp, that Fripp might be looking for a band in the near future too. Fripp ultimately made the choice to move forward with the plan of a new band in January of 1981 and contacted Bill Bruford, who, now at something of a loose end, agreed to an arrangement with Fripp. In his initial discussions with Fripp, Bruford suggested that one of his bandmates from the Bruford band, bassist Jeff Berlin, might be a fit for the new project that they were going to launch. Fripp listened to some of the music that Bruford had done and decided that Berlin's style was not to his liking. Too busy, I think, was the way in which it was put. And so Bruford agreed that they would look for a bass player and for a fourth person to join in another role. That fourth person would be Adrian Belew. Following the League of Gentlemen shows in July, where Belew's band Gaga opened for the League, Belew signed up to do work both in the studio and on the road with Talking Heads. Talking Heads were produced by Brian Eno, and so there was linkage to Robert Fripp through that contact, as well as the prior acquaintance that Fripp and Belew had made. Belew is very much in attendance on Talking Heads' studio album from 1980, Remain in Light, as well as on the live album that followed it in 1982. The name of this band is Talking Heads. Fripp actually contacted Belew in late 1980 to begin floating the idea of being in a band together with him. Belew was interested, but his answer was, "Let me think about it." He was relatively comfortable with what Talking Heads were doing. He was playing some very large shows with them and enjoying the notoriety that he was getting from that. Ultimately, he would be invited to be a participant in the Talking Heads side project that Talking Heads bassist and drummer Tina Weymouth and Chris Franz founded, called the Tom Tom Club, with Belew joining Weymouth and Franz in Nassau at Compass Point Studios to record their first album. And it was of particular note for Belew because, having participated in those sessions, he got the attention of Island Records' Chris Blackwell, who offered Belew a recording contract of his own. Things, however, soured with Talking Heads, in particular following Belew's participation in the Tom Tom Club album, where he participated in songwriting but wasn't given credit for his efforts. That is, in fact, something that has since been corrected, but at the time it made the relationship between Belew on one hand and Weymouth and Franz on the other rather frosty. Fripp would, when Talking Heads' tour found its way to the UK in early 1981, reached out to Belew again with an offer of playing in a band with him. This time Belew accepted, on one condition, which was that he wanted the ability to pursue his own solo career while he was working with Fripp. And Fripp agreed to this proposal from Belew. Belew was on board. That meant they needed to find a bassist. After about 3 days of auditions, where Bruford would try to conduct aspiring candidates for the bass chair through an odd piece of music in 17/8 time, something tells me this might have been the genesis of the King Crimson number, Frame by Frame. After several days of auditions using that approach, the band was contacted by Tony Levin, who expressed interest in joining. Levin signed on without an audition. Fripp went on record following this saying, "If I had known Tony was interested in a band, I wouldn't have held auditions. He'd have been my first call." And the lineup was set. The band was initially called Discipline, as was hinted on the Run-Out Groove of the League of Gentlemen album. They began working together in the early spring of 1981 and had their first concert in late April of that year. In their early concerts, the band was known as Discipline. But that would soon change. EG Records wanted to market this band in a big way, given the name recognition of the players who were in it. And the name Discipline was not one that they felt was a strong one. The American members of the band, Belew and Levin, always felt a little uncomfortable with it, and they apparently openly asked Fripp whether King Crimson wouldn't be a better name. And Fripp probably had thought of this himself, either through perusing it on his own, but almost certainly also with input from EG Records, who would have craved the recognition that the name King Crimson would have brought to this new project. By the time the band were recording in the late spring of 1981, EG Records had a new distribution contract in the United States as well with Warner Brothers Records. Warner was very keen on the band, provided they used the King Crimson name. But they also knew the history of the old King Crimson, so there was a catch. They insisted on a 3-album deal, something which probably came back to haunt the band in different ways after the fact. The band worked quickly on its album, collecting 7 songs in the studio, and the album was complete by late June of 1981. I learned about the project by chance around that same time. I lived in Manhattan at the time, and I frequently went into Lower Manhattan to shop at the various record stores in the area. And on a particular day in June of 81, I happened into a record store where I was able to find the press kit that was being distributed by Polydor to support Robert Fripp's Exposure album from a year or so before. And the person behind the counter said, "Oh, do you know he's coming out with a new album too?" The clerk shared with me the details of what was happening, still under the name of Discipline. I was excited, to say the least. I wanted to see a band with these musicians play. I thought this was going to be a wonderful experience. I found out a little bit more a few weeks later. Back in those days, I often would pick up copies of the Village Voice to get a sense of who was coming through town, what acts might be worth seeing. And on the classified pages, of all places, in The Voice, I saw an advertisement at the bottom of the page for a set of shows at the Washington Square Church in Greenwich Village in late July and early August of 1981. An artist's name was not given, but the description of the show was an evening of Frippertronics and conversation. Oh boy, I said, I know who this is. But why is he doing a Frippertronics show now if he's starting a new band? I'm not sure that makes sense. Fripp was apparently still living in New York and wanted to use his residency in the area to talk up the show in New York in a very big way. The show I saw at Washington Square Church was breathtaking. Fripp went through the entire process of Frippertronics, creating the backdrop tape, rewinding it, and then playing solo over it. And it was masterful. And I wish I had a recording of it. It was just a wonderful evening, particularly underscored by the fact that this was a very small venue. If there were 30 people in the room watching Fripp create this music, it was a lot. Following the show, Fripp made good on his promise for conversation and took questions from the audience. Several days before, Fripp had leaked to the New York media that the name of the band was no longer Discipline. It was indeed King Crimson. This was probably out of necessity because of the fact that the album, Discipline, was going to be released by Warner Brothers in just a few weeks. And so he wanted to make sure that he got all the packaging right for his appearance on radio. His appearance, by the way, was with the disc jockey Scott Muni from WNEW-FM, who had been a longtime friend of all things progressive rock in support of King Crimson, Yes, Genesis, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and other such bands. Fast forward to November. The new version of King Crimson spent several days at other venues on the eastern seaboard of the United States prior to coming to New York in early November. They played 6 shows on 3 dates at the Savoy, a small theater in Midtown Manhattan, an early and a late show on November 5th, 6th, and 7th, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday nights. I saw the early show on Friday, and that is a show that is forever imprinted on my brain from beginning to end. The band played the Discipline album in its entirety, although not in sequence, and also played some other songs that were absolutely spine-tingling. Adrian Belew introduced the first of these by saying, "This was the first song from the last King Crimson album. and the band went on to play Red. Red was composed during the Red sessions in the summer of 1974 and had never been played live by the earlier version of King Crimson with Wetton and Bruford as a result. So hearing this song in a live setting was making my hair stand up at the back of my neck. It was just really amazing. The band also played 3 songs that night from the album that would be called Beat the following year. One of them was announced as being from King Crimson's next album, that song being Neil and Jack and Me. The other 2 songs from Beat that were included were Sartori and Tangier and Neurotica, which I think at this juncture was still being called Manhattan by the band. The band ended the show with a blistering version of Lark's Tongues and Aspic Part 2. Again, the hair on my neck was standing straight up. Absolutely amazing. One thing that struck me, though, about this band was how versatile they were as far as the dynamics of their presentation. They could play the hard rock of Red and Lark's Tongues, but they could also turn around and play songs like Mataku Desai and The Sheltering Sky that were far more delicate and do that in a riveting way. Again, a wonderful show. One of the other very memorable performances from this night was of the song Indiscipline, the great song in 5/4 time that includes Adrian Belew's lyrics about a painting that his then wife Margaret had created.
I like it!
And I still like it. It took Robert Fripp well over 6 years to get from the end of the Wetton Bruford era of King Crimson to the Belew Bruford Levin era in 1981. But it was certainly worth the wait. Thanks for taking this ride through history with me. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, please click like on the video. If you're not already a subscriber to the channel, please join. And if you have any comments, please let me know. I do my best to answer whenever I can. You take good care. We'll be back soon. Bye-bye.